My sister was also the spiritual leader of the family. She bought us rosaries a lot. She bought, well, religious leader, maybe not spiritual, but she bought us rosaries for Christmas, for our birthday, for 4th of July, Memorial Day, and Labor Day. We had rosaries hanging out of everything that jutted out of a wall. So she was the religious leader of the family. She was also in that nice girl role. You know, she didn't talk much, so everybody figured she must be very nice. They didn't know what she was thinking, but you know, she was very nice. Nice, the quiet one, I guess you'd call that too, quiet. She was a family hero also in that she made the family look good because she was so good, and that's really the function of the hero. She was also a victim. She was a victim of the abandonment, of all the violence that she witnessed, of all the covert sexual abuse. One of the things that happened is my parents fought a lot. They fought almost every day, and they fought about money. You might say that's financial abuse, but I don't think they really ever fought about money, but I did figure out that was probably why I have some issues around money. Like, I'd rather buy 3 pair of pants on sale that don't fit than 1 pair for the same price it does. You know, why? Well, I get 3 pair, but they don't fit. Yeah, but they might. I have an eating disorder. You know, it's like, I'm going to go shorter and taller with this eating disorder. But what I finally realized was that my parents never really fought about money. What they were always fighting about was sex. They were fighting about sexual inadequacy, sexual fears, sexual control, sexual jealousies, mostly jealousy. You know, and I think that the whole time I was growing up, that the children in the family that I grew up in were all sexually abused by their hassles, their covert fights. It's like they didn't have the courage or maybe permission or awareness to be able to fight about what the fight was about. In fact, if they could, maybe they could have resolved it. You know, but I had a chance. I figured this out some years ago, but last year I had a chance to talk to them about it, and they agreed. They said, yep, it was all about jealousy. You know, and they told me a whole bunch of stories about the jealousy and about the battering, and the battering came from jealousy. And it made me even think one step further, that in a way the physical abuse in my family was really about sexualized rage and jealousy, and they got projected in different people. But there was a level of that was sexual abuse as well. So anyway, victim of all of that type of abuse. I guess my sister is somewhat of a caretaker as well, and she was definitely the little parent in the family. In fact, my sister had her first child at 3 years old, her second at 5, and then she had another one at 11 or 12. And guess what she does for a living? She teaches. She teaches kindergarten. And she teaches kindergarten in a school setting that she has set up like a living room. She sort of plays house with them. But what I've noticed is she spent her entire life in someone else's living room raising someone else's kids. You know, and she never had children of her own. You know, and I think she was burnt out on parenting, actually. My brother came along. And my brother, you know, the needs of the family were there, and the needs of the family were very much for a scapegoat at this point. Someone to take on the burden of the violence, and he did. He was a painful birth of my mother's. He was supposed to be a twin, and there's some incident, and I don't know if it had to do with alcohol, but I suspect, and then, you know, he was born prematurely, and I guess it was a hassle for them. And it was at that point that they found a place to vent. And I think that because of my brother, they were able to stay together for the next 50 years. If he hadn't come along, I don't know what they would have done. So he was the scapegoat. And a scapegoat really is a victim, but it's a victim where the violence or anger or blame is encapsulated more on one child than the others. And almost all families have that. It's very interesting. Think of your family, and there's several siblings. You'll usually find one that was blamed, looked at differently, or hurt more or differently than the others, and that's the scapegoat. My brother also had many other roles. My brother acted out a lot, But then he got into football and wrestling. And this is where a scapegoat can use the rage. You know, he weighed like 140 pounds and played tackle in the toughest conference in Minnesota. In his first year as a sophomore, he got honorable mention All-State. Why? Well, because he liked to kill people. And everybody say, oh, what a good family he must come from. Look at how hard he tackles. You know, it's like, so he became the family hero, the athlete. My dad decided that it wasn't okay for him to be playing football, and so he had to get a job. Well, it's very interesting because he did. He got a job at a garden center, and he used to come home dirty and late, and he was very clever because he made an arrangement where the owner of the garden center would keep the money that he earned as a college fund. You know, and my dad wasn't crazy about this because he always took our money when we earned it and used it. You know, and so, but he agreed. It even made sense to my dad. But about 6 months later, my brother disappeared. Actually, we got a call a couple days later from Hannibal, Missouri, Mark Twain's birthplace. I guess you can't hitchhike through Hannibal. And so he was picked up by the police. So we went down and got him. But before we went down and got him, I was with my dad at the time. We stopped at the garden center where he was working and walked in and said, to explain what had happened, that he'd be back, you know, kind of trying to protect his job. Well, they'd never heard of him. He hadn't worked there at all. The whole thing was a con. And I think that if my brother hadn't been a hero before then, he became my hero at that moment. He was going to the beach and fooling around with his friends at the bowling alley. So anyway, my brother developed a new role. And you know, it's interesting because my brother has never had anything that he hasn't given away. But if he doesn't think he's tricking people to get it, he doesn't enjoy getting it. You know, he's got that part still. My brother's also an addict. He's the one, anything worth doing is worth doing compulsively. I recently intervened on him. I said, Jim, you're an amazing person. There's 203 different 12-step programs in the United States, and you'd feel right at home at any one of them. So, anyway. My sister is also, I got to give her credit for an addiction. And her addiction is somewhat the thin, fat eating disorder stuff, but it's also male dependency. There is no life outside of a relationship with a man. You know, and I think part of her dealing with the male dependency was to enter the convent. But then she left the convent. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Anyway, hero, con, addict. My brother is very much a caretaker and very much an extension of Dad. But being an extension of a parent is an easy one to miss. In many respects, he's very much like my father. In many respects, he's very different. But when my brother was 17, my dad got him another job, and that was working with him. So bought him a car just like his, loaded it with sewing machines just like the ones he was selling, and sent him out to sell. In fact, I remember we went to Montana for our first run. I was 15, he was 17. 2 kids going out to sell sewing machines to ranchers in Montana. And we asked directions, and so we decided to go right across the ranch, and we got hung up on a big rock in the field. And I think the car is still there as a monument to sending kids out too early. You know, we took a bus home. We didn't know what to do with the sewing machines or the car. Got them another car and sent them out again, and they've been working together pretty much ever since. And he's sort of got the same script about, you know, making a lot of money and then failing completely, and that's the cycle. Very much like my father. I came along next, and actually when I came along I was very cute. I was really. I mean, I had long golden curly hair that I'd kill for now. In fact, my mother cut my hair, and that was the only thing I've never forgiven her for, because it never quite grew back that way again. And so, anyway, someday I'm going to have one hair left, and it's going to fall out, and then I go around and say, I lost my hair today. Some of you might know, too, that I'm in one of those transplant programs, right? I'm a donor, so. Anyway, okay, so I was the mascot. And I was cute, and I was there to entertain the family. I lost my mascot role when my younger brother was born, and so I became a lost child, and I spent several years sitting on the neighbor's step saying, I don't know, what do you want to do? And he'd say, I don't know, what do you want to do? And I'd say, I don't know, what do you? That's all we did for 2 years, nothing else. And then I found a place. I found that I found sports, and I could do well in sports, and so I became an extension of my dad. I became the athlete that he never was or couldn't be. And he didn't go to my games. I was in athletics from about 9 to 16. I was one of those adolescent athletic burnouts. But my dad wasn't the typical Little League father whose son is a projection of him out there. But my dad sort of used my athletics as a way to access what he could have been and bragged about it, but he never went to the games. And I didn't know why it was. I didn't enjoy it anymore, but I really wasn't doing it for me. It was all taken over by him, even though he wasn't there. When I was 26, I ran my first marathon. And I called my dad, and I said, I just ran a marathon, 26.2 miles, nonstop. I gave him my time. His response to me, his first words were, I was the fastest kid in Sioux City, Iowa. In other words, it still had nothing to do with what I was doing, it always only to access what he could have or did do. You know, and so, extension of Dad. I think I also found another place besides athletics when I was 9 years old, and that was my mother didn't have a husband, so I became her husband. You know, I let her cry on my shoulder, and I took care of her, and I talked to her and entertained her. And so, you know, essentially, she became my first client, too. I'm 9 years old, I'm married, and I have my first client. Now, I call that emotional incest. My mom calls that career development. So, anyway. Surrogate spouse. I also was a mediator in the family. Whoops. Remember what W.C. Fields once said, anybody that can't spell a word more than one way is a real dummy, so ignore this one. I was a caretaker. I was sort of the family analyzer, if you will. I was always trying to figure out what was going on, you know, and I think I still am trying to figure out what's going on. What is going on? And I also be addict, a victim. And I don't want to leave off that in the victimization, I also learned how to offend. I learned how to hurt people. I know that I hurt my kids. In The Prince of Tides, there's a line about that Pat Conroy wrote in the book. He's on a picnic with his family, and his dad beats up his brother, and that usually spoils the picnic, unless you really hate your brother, right? But he says, I decided I would not be like my father. I decided I would not be like my father. Any of you ever decide that? Yeah. See, you didn't even know him. Anyway, I got you. But you know, it's like Pat Conroy said in the next line. He said, but I became exactly like my father. You see, what my father did with rage or fists, I did with looks and words. You know, I could turn that warm summer afternoon, too, into a cold winter night with a glance, with a shaming look or word. You know, and that violence is more covert, but it's the same. You know, and I know I learned to offend in that way, by withdrawing or by shaming. My younger brother came along, and my brother, he was the clown, he was the mascot, the tension reliever. He was also my dad's best buddy. Almost like a surrogate spouse, but more like a buddy. And he became an extension of Dad as well. In fact, my dad had my 3 sons, right? All of them were extensions of some aspect of him. The extension of Dad that he became was, he became the wild and crazy part of my dad. See, my dad used to brag about all the fights, all the crazy stuff they did. My brother actually went out and did all of those things. And I think he had like 14 motorcycle wrecks in a space of about 3 months. You know, and my dad would always fix his motorcycle. That was the only thing in our family that ever got fixed. Well, actually, it was my motorcycle, but my brother always used it and wrecked it. My younger brother was a charmer. I think he got a lot of support for that from my mom. In fact, he eventually became the surrogate spouse to my mom when I left, so that role went over there. My younger brother, in being an extension of Dad and being wild and crazy, he also eventually rebelled. He was definitely the rebel. But remember that 180 degrees from sick is still sick, and the opposite of everything is true. So guess how my brother rebelled against my dad's alcoholism? By becoming addicted to other drugs. You know, he just found his own drugs to be addicted to. He went into the Marines, also part of the rebellion from the family. He came out of the Marines, he was very chemically dependent, and he started working with my dad, being an extension of him in the business stuff. My brother also became the family sacrifice. He OD'd on Tuinal and alcohol about 19 years ago. And that's the hardest thing to talk about, even almost 20 years later, because it feels like the one thing of all this that's irrevocable. You know, I know there's other parts like lost childhood and things that are irrevocable, but that's the one that feels the most irrevocable. And I think he was trying to, maybe he committed the suicide that my dad never committed, but I have a suspicion it was really that emotionally he was also an extension of my mom, and he got enmeshed in a lot of her despair and emotional reality. I haven't talked much about enmeshment, but you know, we get enmeshed very much in the denial of a family. If we can see it, we can make a choice, and model behavior is powerful teaching. But where we really get enmeshed is what we don't see. That's what we tend to reenact the most of. And so I think we can get enmeshed in the hopes and dreams of parents. We can get enmeshed in a lot of things, but the denial is the key. And I've talked before about how adolescent suicide is, second leading cause of death among adolescent males, I think third among all children. And I've worked with a lot of families where there was an adolescent suicide. And almost all families that I've worked with, when I was able to find out the information, I found that mom or dad or both had a death wish that they hadn't been dealing with. And that I think that the child more often gets enmeshed and does the suicide that the parent obsesses or doesn't deal with. And I'd talked about that for a long time, and I knew that my brother was really in his adolescence. He was 22 years old when he suicided. But there was a part I forgot. That was when I was 9 years old. I walked into the garage one day because the car was running and the garage doors were closed. And my mom was in there slumped over the wheel. And I brought her into the house. And, you know, I think there was one other time that I can't quite remember, but it never got talked about. But I believe it got acted out. And so, in fact, I think her mother was probably suicidal as well. That's my guess from what I hear. You know, and so I really think that in some ways the sacrifice, the message my brother was trying to give to the family was really a message that had been in the family. It was a suicidality that had been in the family before, and it was a case of enmeshment. Anyway, these are some of the roles of my family. Now, the important part is that the roles change. But even as the roles change, and even as we leave the roles that we've had, there's a tendency to fall back on those roles in other times of our life, in times of stress, you know, in work settings, in family. And there's a residual impact of each role in our life. And part of that impact is the emotional denial that's built into the role itself. What does the mascot do? The mascot entertains and jokes around, but never really is allowed the impact of their own emotional reality, and they are there to distract other people from theirs. And you know, I'd rather joke than fight, joke than cry, and I do tend to minimize my own feelings as not being very important. The impact of being a mascot is still important. Now, there's often an upside to the role, because I love being playful, you know, and I can have a good time. You know, so there's an upside too. I think that most of these roles in recovery can be strengths. I think all of them can become strengths in our recovery process. The lost child. The lost child has no place to go with their feelings, so they end up usually just stuffing them and feeling isolated. The extension, as an extension of my father, I end up with more of his emotional reality. In other words, my father claims to have never felt shame in his life about anything. He also claims to have never made a mistake, except I think that was at least one of them, that claim. But, you know, it's like I felt like everything I did was a mistake, and I felt shame about almost everything. See, and so that's more of the enmeshment coming from being an extension of him. The surrogate spouse role. I don't get to have feelings. I take care of my mother's feelings. I respond to hers, and I end up with a lot of her emotional burden as well. The mediator, trying to fix, you know, I still tend to muck around in other people's business too much. It's very hard for me to butt out when someone's having a problem or a relationship isn't going right. I kind of get in there, triangulate. Caretaker. This was a tough one for me because I realized that most of my life, all of my life, I had spent taking care of other people's feelings, other people's problems, instead of dealing with my own. In fact, when I realized that, I left this field. I left the field. I'd been in the field for about 7 or 8 years, and I left it because I figured I needed to make a decision. You know how you can't be somewhere until you've decided to be there? You can't be married till you decide to be married. You can't even be a parent until you decide, make the decision. And I had never decided to be in this. This was just a continuation of a role I had played out in my life. I think many of our careers are like that, by the way. So I took a break, and I came back. One of the reasons I came back was I developed this program on my break. I thought about, you know, the whole process, and this is what came out of taking the break. And I came back. Before I'd been doing about 80% counseling and 20% teaching. I came back and reversed it. I did 80% teaching and 20% counseling, and I was happy. And what I realized was, even as a child, what I wanted to be was a teacher. In fact, the only adults that had any impact on my life or noticed me in any way were about 4 teachers and 1 coach that I could name, adults. You know, and I think that their impact, their connection to me was minimal. But if you work with kids, never minimize your impact on those kids. One little noticing can make a huge difference in their life. So just a couple statements or a little noticing made me decide that I want to be a teacher and gave me enough affirmation, I think, to pursue it and find it. But I needed that break, and I needed to make a decision from that caretaking, nurturing stuff. The family analyzer, you know, kind of living in my head, detached emotionally from myself and others, intellectualizing, if you will. The addict certainly has caused me enough problems in my life. And the role of victim / offender / enabler or collusive. All 3 roles are learned in a low-functioning family. And the victim doesn't get to have their feelings. The offender projects their feelings at others, and the enabler, you know, is detached emotionally and enabling other people to self-destruct with their feelings. There's other roles. Anybody can think of another role that they might see in their family? And anybody identify with every role here? Okay, that's called the chameleon role. It's almost like the perfect codependent. You'll be whatever the situation or person needs you to be at any given time of your life. Okay. How about anybody not have any sense of what role they had? Like, it's hard to spot a role that you might have played. Anybody? Okay. That's usually a lost child, orphan, abandoned, you know, a disconnected kind of role. You know, there is a role in that, though. What you call the role can make a difference. Like, how many of you were lost children, at least for a period of time? Okay. And do you still, you know, like for me, the lost child role, I live on Northwest Airlines. I'm not sure if I have a home. You know, I did have a home, and I recently decorated it to look like a Holiday Inn so I feel at home while I'm there. Bought a microwave so I could have airplane food at home, too, you know. But now, for some of us, the lost child is the role. But for others of us, it may be we felt more like orphans. You felt like you were found in the street, parked in a corner, and forgotten about. But you know you could not belong to or of this family. Okay, you're like an orphan or a mistake, a switched birth. Okay, yeah. And so that's a different kind. The role might seem similar, but what we call the role can make it feel differently. You know, to be a mascot is one thing. To have to be the clown in the family is another. And so there's a little different words, and the word can make a difference.
Excuse me.
Jen?
I just found another role, and I don't know what to call it. So, and it seems like probably what you did, and it's what I did.
Mm-hmm.
The person who breaks away from the family, who decides that they're going to actually leave the family at an early age.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I walked out of my home at 18, and it was. I mean, I kept doing the, going home and visiting or paying homage to my parents and
Sure.
all that. But it was also interesting that my son graduated from high school on Sunday night, and his bags were packed, and he walked out at 6 a.m. the next morning.
Sure. It's almost
For
like.
different reasons, I think.
Yeah.
But what is this person who? I don't understand what I'm trying to say, but there is a role there.
Anybody have a sense of what you might call that role? It's not the runaway. There's a runaway role too that you could have. In some ways, it's rebelling against the family. It's a leave it all behind role, but we still carry it with us.
Independent.
Yeah, independent, because we can't. It's like that codependent, independent switch, where the independent doesn't look codependent, but they don't get in relationships because they lose too much themselves in the relationship, so we leave. In fact, what we call a codependent that stays out of relationships is an independent, but it's still a little different than that, I think, yeah. You can make a sentence out of a role if you need to. Sort of like some Native Americans named, you could be the one who left but carried it with you.
I tried to leave it all behind, but you woke up one day and found you still have it.
Yes, yeah, you were in bed with it, and it was you. Okay. Anybody else have? Anybody had to be the general in their family? Yeah. How about the oracle, the philosopher, the font of wisdom, or something?
Tour director.
Or the tour director, okay, who's also lost. Not the kind of tour director you really want, but, okay. Anybody else? How about dad's dad? Anybody have to parent dad? Yeah, okay. Mom's mom, whatever. Parent's parent. If you're a little stuck on some of the roles, there's an easy way. You put the blank one. And if you fill in the blank, you'll often find several roles. Put smart in there. You had to be the smart one. Or maybe dumb. Or maybe the pretty one. Or the charming one. Or the seductive one. Or you had to be a lady killer for dad. Or Prince Charming for mom. Some of the roles are based on fairy tales. In fact, if you're living outside of town and you have 7 children and you name them Dopey, Sneezy, Doc, and you're living alone with these children, you might have been scripted. If you're hanging around waiting for the, white knight and the white horse to come and take you away, you might find this person, but they usually take you to live with his mother. If you're kissing a lot of toads, and marry one, you might find that it'll still be a toad. And so, it's like, the we do get scripted by stories that we attach to. Roles are also about gender. Male and female roles in family are very important. And some families, it restricts your choices. Roles are about physical characteristics that we get scripted because we look like someone. We look like crazy Uncle Harry, so we're sleeping in cars by the time we're 19 like Uncle Harry did. Or we look like Dad, so we do 10 to 20 like Dad did. I think that roles are also about birth order. There's the oldest, the middle, and the last child. There's also another approach that is the first, second, third, and fourth children. And kind of first kids have certain roles in the family. They tend to attach or notice or respond to Dad and Dad's messages of who he wants to be or is more. where seconds have a more maintenance role and deal with feelings and sort of react more to who mom is, and thirds have a tendency to react to the relationship, and fourths tend to carry a lot of the burden of the whole family, and can feel crazy in a crazy family and feel lost and misdirected. So ordinal position can affect roles as well. Yes?
What about only children?
Only children are first kids that have a different socialization process, and that's a definite role that can affect our life and our choices and how we live. And sometimes the only child can be bonded to both parents, and that double bonding stuff, which I'll talk about in a little while. Yeah, Paul?
I noticed one who takes on all the morality or modesty in the family to make up for the others that lack it.
Okay, sort of the righteous role, or maybe it's the, it's not quite the savior role, but I know what you're talking about. Yeah, you're going to make up, you do good to make up for the family doing or being bad or something, yeah. Okay.